as we said, I mean, we just 3 sessions on the making of the Bible, and the first one we were looking at sort of internal stuff within the Bible itself, how the Bible tells us it was constructed, and we looked at one particular important point where they discover the scroll, the book of Deuteronomy in the temple, and that changes how the emphasis of certain parts of the Bible, and adds, you know, a new, a bigger emphasis on the story of Moses over the story of Abraham. And then last week we looked at inspiration, and we called it inspired. What is it? Inspired or inspiring? And I think we sort of got to a point where we saw that the Holy Spirit was at work in a very kind of fluid way, in both in the development of Scripture itself, in the authors and the writers, but also in the people who edit it, and then in the people who read it. So it's a very organic thing, and something the Bible we make very personal as well. Jill, you wanted to add something, you said.
I did, because I made a note of a couple of the readings that we were.
Oh yes.
And I actually looked them up in the King James Version, and they do read very differently. So I just think it's something to bear in mind, that cross-reference different versions of the Bible, because it does read differently. And I think possibly as the Bible's been translated, it probably has lost a little bit of its original meaning, perhaps.
That's a really interesting point. We didn't look at translation and interpretations, but translations is really important. And King James, what people would say about the King James Version is that it's a very, very beautiful piece of English writing. It's, you know, it's a high point of English literature, but the accuracy of the translation is not as great. There's been, you know, several hundred years of scholarship, and people say, I always use the New Revised Standard Version, and I think people say the New International Version is I don't know if you know, Peter, how people sort of view the accuracy of that. But even with the New Revised Standard Version, if you look at any commentary, you will see the commentators will, and I've got a commentary here on Matthew's Gospel, just here, and the person writing the commentary will have translated, you know, it for themselves, you know, because they want to show in the translation that their understanding and interpretation of the text is reflected in the text, you know, on the page. And I've got another one at home, which is very literal translation with no attempt to make it good English. So it reads like a gas bill, you know, very uninteresting. So when you're translating it, not only do you have to get the accuracy, but you also have to make it sound good when it's read in church, and that changes things.
Yeah.
And what people will do is they'll look at a Greek word, and the scholars will then look at how that Greek word is used in right throughout Greek literature, and then try and come to a conclusion. But of course, loads of English words can mean quite different things in different contexts, you know. I mean, I think of a word, alley. Think of the word alley, you know. It could mean a bowling alley. It could mean the back of a tenement in Blackburn. You know, I mean, it could mean a whole lot, just a few things. And so in 2,000 years' time, if people are looking to the Old English and trying to work out what the Old English meant, they might find completely erroneous understanding of the word in other contexts. you're absolutely right, Jill. That's really, really big issue.
And occasionally with Bible translations, the views of the Bible translator affect how they translate text. An example I always give is if you look at the Roman Catholic Bible, it will say that Jesus had cousins. When it translates the word adelphoi, which could mean brothers or cousins, and it translates it cousins because, according to Roman Catholics, Jesus couldn't have brothers because Mary was perpetually virgin. So your views will affect how you translate a Bible text. So that's just something I always say to students to be aware of, where the Bible translation is coming from, and certain decisions will be made on that basis, even if unconsciously.
Right. Well, today we're kind of going to look at what is traditionally called the kind of construction of the making of the canon, and the canon is the kind of just literally means the rule, or so how we come to the collection of books that we have, how we got to the point where the Bible, the Bible I've got here is not the Bible we have in the back of Union Chapel. It's because this one is the Catholic Bible edition. It's got books that the Protestant Bible doesn't have. So how does it get to be? And it's become kind of a hot issue and a controversial issue, and it all began with the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which we all know is a load of rubbish. But it got, particularly American evangelicals, into a complete tiz. When anything that comes up that is in any way kind of a film or anything that appears to be contradictory to the Orthodox things, then people get unnecessarily provoked and worked up. And I think, I haven't read the book, I've seen the film, but I think the kind of thing in Dan Brown's book is that the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, which was set up by the Emperor Constantine, they sat down and made a decision about which books were in the Bible at the Council of Nicaea. And up until then, there had been a whole load of books around, and the church made a decision as to which books were going to be in the Bible. And of course, Constantine is reputed to have been the person who turned the Roman Empire into a Christian empire, which is not true. He didn't do that, and neither did the Council of Nicaea make decisions about which books were in the Bible. They made decisions about the relationship between Jesus and the Spirit and God, and they were dealing with those kind of issues. But Dan Brown in his book says that Emperor Constantine decided what was going to be in the Bible. The implication of that is that the Bible is not an inspired document. The implication is that it's just a matter of choice. And what were the books which were left out? And there's a scholar called Bart Ehrman, who's now become the bête noire of the fundamentalists, who has made this argument that there's just a whole load of books floating around, and at some point in the 4th century, they said, okay, these are the ones that we accept. And then a whole load of conspiracy theories then come out of that. And on the internet, if you want to know any rubbish, there's masses of rubbish on the internet. And in the Vatican Library, there are secret documents which show that Jesus was married, and there's a whole load of stuff that the Roman Catholic Church doesn't want you to know about, and so on and so on and so on. And so it's become a kind of very controversial, hot issue. And I have to say that sort of evangelical theologians, the more, the more academic ones, have actually come up with some really thoughtful and quite good answers to that, which are quite helpful, and we'll share some of those tonight. So that's why it's become controversial. But also, as I said, the Bible or a Bible, we, I think here, are all familiar with the Protestant Bible, and less familiar with the Roman Catholic Bible, and even less familiar with the Coptic and Orthodox Bible. So there are different, sets of lists of books which are seen as authoritative. So my kind of first question before we delve into it is it important? Does it matter? Is it interesting? How vital is it to our understanding of the importance and authority of Scripture that these controversies arise, or are we quite cool about it?
Well, I mean, there's at different points in history, there's been books removed, which I think will kind of given very little importance just in published Bibles. That I think it's a shame, like to have done that to, like what Luther did with James, for example, in his translation. He kind of he sort of indexed it into a sort of supplementary section or something like that, didn't he? But then again, as we've been talking about, Vaughan, I mean, I wouldn't want any of the Gnostic Gospels in the Bible, because then they're just not good. They're not good. And I think quite rightly so. Some Bible historians or whatever have said that Jesus can even come off as quite mean-spirited in them, especially in Judas. And I think you just don't want that, don't want that in your Bible. So
right, yeah. A bit later on, now we can look at one of the Gospels which wasn't included. Not one of the wackier ones, but I mean, there's one, isn't it, the Apocalypse of Peter, when I think it's that one where the cross actually speaks. And the soldiers ask a question after Jesus has been taken from the cross, and the cross itself says yes. Yeah.
Nightmare fuel, isn't it, really?
Okay, go on.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it from from my specialisms, and thinking about it if you were approaching this as a literary study, and took out everything to do with any kind of religious or spiritual associations, silly as that is, but if you just go with me for a moment, then I would always want my students to understand the social and historical context within which the text was produced. And that's complex with the Bible, because it's not just one text for a start. But as the book is now, at some point a decision was made that that's how it should be. Well, there are so many layers of decisions, aren't there? Because there's a decision about what to include and what not to include. And I think people need to know about those decisions and why they were made. And I go with what Harley's saying, so it's not that there's any conspiracy theory here. It's just that the books weren't really very good and they didn't fit, and I think that's important to know, rather than to go, oh no, we can't go there. It's God inspired, therefore that's it.
Yeah.
But I also think, the other layer that we often don't talk about is when the Bible was translated into our language, and to look at the context of, the 16th century and Tyndale and all that was going on there, and the horror around what happened to Tyndall and how it was seen as a terrible thing that he did by many. Until then, suddenly Henry VIII went, "No, it's all right. Actually, we'll give every church Bible." After he'd had him burnt, at the stake. So, I think those stories are important to tell because it's all part of the Bible, and it's all part of the context. So, I think it's not a simple answer, but I think that context is important to us, and it's a living book, and it lives with us now. And how we respond to it obviously as 21st century citizens.
Absolutely. Let me just share some things with you then. Where are we? Okay. I mean, these are just what I think seems to be the kind of criteria by which books were included. Three kind of core things. And the first one, and we see as we're going along, the first one, and the most important one, is apostolic authorship or source. And that is really important to the New Testament. We talk about the New Testament now. That is really important for the New Testament, and we'll see that, as we go along that has a huge influence on what goes in and what doesn't. The second is that the teaching is sound, as Peter was saying. People want to be sure that it reflects, doctrine of the church, and then its relevance. Is this going to be relevant to particular situations? And that all of the writings, I mean, as you study New Testament books, you can see that, again, as Neil was saying, that you look in the context and you see what was going on in the church at the time as a way of understanding it. And I've just put in this quote from what is the Muratorian fragment. Have you heard of the Muratorian fragment? It was a little bit of a fragment of Latin text which was found by a man called Mr. Muratori, hence the name, in the 1700s or something, in a library in Milan. And it was what is now believed to have been a second century text. The earliest copy they've got is a 7th and 8th century. And it's a list of books that are regarded as scriptural. And in it, he wrote this, this beautiful book, The Shepherd, the Shepherd of Hermas, which is a 2nd century book, I think. Yeah, it's a 2nd century book. And in the Muratorian fragment, it says, "But Hermas wrote The Shepherd, most recently in our time in the city of Rome. Our Bishop Pius, his brother, was occupying the chair of the church of the city of Rome. And therefore it ought indeed to be read." So it's a nice book. And it's sound in teaching, but it cannot be read publicly to the people in church, either among the prophets, whose number is complete. So all of the Old Testament books are regarded as being fixed, or among the apostles, that's the New Testament, for it is after their time. So you have this kind of thing that it's a nice book, it'd be lovely to have it in the Bible, but we can't, because it hasn't got that, it's too recent. It doesn't have the authenticity of the apostles. So what you getting in the New Testament, what the early church wanted in the New Testament, is the witness of the apostles to be, in written form, to be handed on and ready. And sometimes nowadays, instead of talking about Old Testament, New Testament, which is slightly problematic for our relationship with Jewish community, as we saw in Rome when we looked at Romans, that they talk about the Hebrew Bible and they talk about the apostolic witness, and they call the New Testament the apostolic witness. And that really is what it is. It's what it's intended to be. Just to remind ourselves, really, you know, that by the time of Jesus, you know, the Hebrew Bible was pretty well sort of sorted, although it took a long time before it was absolutely finalized. And one of the issues for the Hebrew Bible is that there are lots and lots of different versions of it. There are lots of different, when people copied them or rewrote them, you know, so some verses read differently in early manuscripts, you know, one from the other. But we know that Jesus himself was drawing upon a canon of scripture, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. He interpreted to them things about himself and all the scriptures. And the Hebrew Bible at the time of Jesus was substantially the same as today in terms of the numbers, except there were 24 books. How many do we have? I know the answer to this because somebody once told me that the number of books in the Old Testament is the same as first Isaiah, i.e. 39, and the number of books in the New is the same as the second and third Isaiahs, which is 16, isn't it? So there you go. But the 24 books were counted differently. So 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles were counted as one. And 1 Kings, 2 Kings were counted as one. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel was one. And then all of the minor prophets, you know, Amos, Hosea, and all of those, they managed to fit on one scroll. So they counted as one. That Council in only year 90, Council of Jamnia, Jewish Council of Jamnia, confirmed the 3 Torah books, Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the writings. And so when the Jews talk about the Tanakh, the Ta is Torah, Na is Nevi'im, and Ka is Ketuvim. So there you go. And then by the 9th century, a Jewish family invested in consolidating all the various versions of the text that they had, and all the different documents that they had, copies of it, and they produced the definitive text. It's called the Masoretic text, after the name of the family that sponsored it. And that's the text that we use now in our Bibles. So tell me if this is not interesting. But then we get the Gospels, and this is quite interesting. They were written somewhere between 60 and 100, and you can argue about whether you go for a later date or an earlier date or whatever. But what you see is, you link this, each of the 4 Gospels is an apostolic authorship. Now, Matthew is anonymous, but the book was given the name Matthew after one of the apostles. But whoever wrote it was clearly an influencer. And I put there's a couple of verses in 1 Peter, which sound very much like the Sermon on the Mount. The implication being that that whoever wrote 1 Peter knew the Gospel of Matthew. Mark is always linked to Peter, from the very earliest times, Mark has been seen as the memoirs of the Apostle Peter. Luke begins his gospel by talking about him having researched and gathered the evidence and talked to eyewitnesses, and he wrote Acts, and John describes himself as the beloved disciple. So the four gospels that get in there are seen to have very direct apostolic authorship, and what makes the gospel seemingly is this combination of the teaching of Jesus and the life of Jesus. And I think this is really interesting, but there is a dependency on each of the four gospels. Although there are differences between the gospels, there's a dependency on each other. So Mark is the first, and Matthew and Luke draw upon Mark. Substantially kind of expand Mark, and John is quite a different style, but each of the stories and sections of John you can link back to a story in the other gospels. And then just so in the 2nd century, this is when you can see how important they have become. Justin Martyr said he was first half of the 2nd century. He referred to the memoirs of the apostles, which the Christians call gospels. So again, this clear thing that they are the memoirs of the gospel. And then Irenaeus, who was a little bit later, he said, it's really interesting, kind of a bit odd, but he said there were 4 gospels because there are 4 corners of the earth, and there were 4 winds. And he linked them to the 4 creatures in Ezekiel chapter 1. You remember Ezekiel 1, I looked, a stormy wind came from the north with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually in the middle of that, something like gleaming on it. In the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They were of human form. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. As for the appearance of their faces, the 4 had the face of a human being, the face of a lion on the right side, the face of an ox on the left side, and the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Irenaeus sort of linked this to the 4 gospels. I mean, how he managed to make that connection, I don't know, but he did. And so, how often have you seen these images of the 4 gospels in Christian art? And then there are these other gospels, hundreds of them actually. Loads of them. The Gospel of Marcion, the Gospel of Mani, the Gospel of Apelles, Barisanes, Basilides, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Judas, the Infancy Gospel of James. There are loads and loads and loads of books around that didn't get in. Okay, anything on this that you want to come in on?
I've never heard of most of these. I've only heard of Thomas, Judas, and Mary, but these are all, they sound a bit manic.
Well, I mean, they're all later, as you see, so they don't have that apostolic kind of claim, but some of them have actually put the name of the gospel of a disciple on there. And some are more bonkers than others. And some are not really bonkers, but they're interesting.
The Infancy Gospel of James.
What's that? Infancy Gospel of James is
what is that?
It's the story of a lot of traditions come from that. It tells the story of the birth of Christ.
Okay, right.
And what was it? The story of Mary, particularly, as having been brought up in the temple. The story is that she was a weaver and was weaving the what do you call it, the veil of the temple.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So quite often in Christian art you see Mary with a spinning wheel. So there's lots of little legends in the infancy Gospel of James, which people liked. And what was the name of the Jesus' grandparents? Anna, was it Anna? I've forgotten now. But the stories about Jesus' grandparents come from the infancy Gospel of James. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
What's the Gospel of Truth?
That was found in Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945. Those scrolls that were found, one of the called them the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah.
I'd be interested in Mary's.
What did you say, Jill?
I'd be interested in Mary's Gospel.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know it actually. What I thought I'd do is share some of the Gospel of Thomas.
I mean, what is interesting about some of those, I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but they try to answer questions that the other Gospels don't answer. So I guess you can understand why some of them are written, because the Gospels don't say anything about Jesus as a child. So let's write a Gospel that says when he was a child, he used his superpowers to zap his teacher or zap his school friend.
So to send a bunch of wolves or bears after a group of children or something like that. There is something like that, isn't there?
Yes, it's sort of trying to speculate what this guy Jesus would have been like as a child, because we don't know what he was like as
all the really nasty things he did.
And of course there's this division in the church right from the early times of the sort of how much the incarnation was physical, and how much Jesus was, a real human being experiencing all this stuff, or is really this about how to get into a spiritual realm and escape this world. So this idea of gnosis, knowledge, is there a secret knowledge that Jesus has and that Christians have, and lots of other sects, not just Christian ones, but would have this idea also that the world was divided between good and evil, and there was all of that. So those kind of ideas were floating around, and so they had to weed out stuff that wasn't authentic. But I think most of these just didn't get in because they weren't written by apostles. Do you want to just look at some of the text from the Gospel of Peter? Because is that yes? Yep. Because obviously it's been given. Thomas, I put the Gospel of Peter. Mistake. I meant the Gospel of Thomas. Yeah, this is the Gospel of Thomas, and most of it parallels the Gospels, and it's just a set of sayings of Jesus, a lot of which are in the other Gospels, some of which aren't. And but it tells none of the story of the life of Jesus, just the sayings. And there is this idea that there was another book floating around called Q, which is Mark has used, and that maybe something like this Gospel of Thomas. But I'll just read this. these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus means a twin, doesn't it? Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. So it's got claiming apostolic authorship. And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Jesus said, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. We've heard that, yeah? And when he finds, he will become troubled. And when he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all. Jesus said, if those who lead you say to you, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and is outside of you. And when you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. What do you make of that? So that's the first introduction.
Well, I mean, I don't get it, and I'm not sure I'm meant to get it. You know, I don't. I just don't really know where to start with it. You know, and it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, it does seem very kind of intentionally mystical to me. You know.
Well, the first few words, these are the secret sayings. I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not intending to be secrets, you know. They're intended to be shared. They're intended to be read in churches, you know. And yes, we saw that thing about Shepherd of Hermas, you know. You say they're authorized to be read in church. That's what they're there for, you know.
I mean, this does rather come across as a type of Gnosticism. I mean, Gnosticism is all about secrecy. I mean, the Gospel of Thomas would appeal to Dan Brown, his worldview, because it's about secrets, and the cognoscenti, only the select few can know these secrets. And that's what it sort of reads like, doesn't it? That unless you're one of the chosen ones, you're not going to understand what all this is about. And you're not meant to understand that either. Having said that, the Gospel of Thomas is the one apocryphal gospel that scholars take more seriously, I think, because it does have some authentic sounding bits in it. That doesn't necessarily mean these bits are authentic as well.
No. I mean, if you see, what did it say? Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. Well, that's in Matthew, isn't it? Seek and you shall find. Ask and the door will be opened to you. Then you also see further down, rather the kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. The kingdom is among you, and so on. So you can see that it's drawing on something which is part of the tradition or oral tradition of the words of Jesus. But look at this then. Do you want to read it, Harley?
Yeah, sure. Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does not hate his father and mother cannot become a disciple to me. And whoever does not hate his brothers and sisters and take up his cross in my way will not be worthy of me. So that's very, very yep. Jesus said the kingdom of the Father is like a man who had good seed. His enemy came by night and sowed weeds among the good seed. The man did not allow them to pull up the weeds. He said to them, I am afraid that you will go intending to pull up the weeds and pull up the wheat along with them. For on the day of the harvest, the weeds were plenty visible, and they will be pulled up and burned. So again, very Matthew.
Isn't it?
Oh,
and actually the bulk of the text in the Gospel of Thomas is rather like that, you know. I mean, it's stuff, and so very often, you know, in commentaries, you'll be analysing a parable and how there's slight variations between Luke and Mark, and then say, and also in the Gospel of Thomas, you know, here's another version of it. and try and do a kind of textual criticism between them. But what do you make of the next quotation? Simon Peter said to him, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. But every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven."
Oh my God. On earth. I mean, this is in
Thomas.
Thomas.
This
Yeah.
is the last verse of the book.
Oh my gosh, what a terrible what a terrible thing to write.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And yeah, just the last quote I put there. Jesus said, "It is those who are worthy of my mysteries that I tell you my mysteries. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing." So it's the Gnostic thing, isn't it? It's mysteries, it's secrets. These are somehow or other magical things, you know. I mean, even changing a woman into a man, you know. I mean, it's kind of, on one level, kind of authentically Jesus. Definitely the voice of Jesus is in there. But on the other hand, it's been framed in a way that is quite different to. So the reason it is not in there is not because some of the words there are not authentically Jesus. The reason it's there is A, it's not genuinely apostolic, and B, it's not framed in a doctrine, in a teaching, you know, which is consistent with the way in which Christian theology had developed. And finally, what was the third criteria was that it's relevant for the church. Yes. And this is not seen as relevant to the church, so it doesn't get in. Whereas, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John meet that criteria.
And I think part of that third criteria is being used profitably in the churches. I think that would be seen as, so it's not just decreeing something from above, but it's actually recognizing what's happening below as well. Grassroots people are using these gospels, not using those, because these are proving to be useful and constructive.
So it is the kind of, I think people do say this. I mean, people, you know, do feel that this is an attack line on Christianity. You know, that there were all these gospels, and then the ones that were chosen were just somehow or other convenient for the church. I mean, and the rest, you know, had something which they don't want you to know about. You know, yeah, it's not true. How are we doing for time? Just very briefly, just in terms of the inclusion of Paul's letters. This is a quote from 1 Corinthians 14. It's really interesting, actually. Anyone who claims to be a prophet. I mean, it comes after the, you know, chapter 13 is the speaking, you know, the love, you know, faith, hope, and love, grace, peace, love, which is a refutation of too much emphasis on the speaking of tongues and so on in church. Then so anyone who claims to be a prophet or have spiritual powers must acknowledge that what I'm writing to you is a command of the Lord. Okay, so Paul is claiming, you know, to be writing as an apostle, and what he's writing is the command of the Lord. And anyone who does not recognize this is not to be recognized. So, my friends, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues. All things should be done decently and in order. So, just this little interesting thing there, that he's making clear that the writings that he has are intended to be not his own words, but authoritative and scriptural and so on. And for that reason, his letters were accepted, you know, right from the earliest kind of understandings of what was acceptable to be read in church and so on. Would you read it that way? Is that reading too much into it?
Although I think, as I said last week, there's that passage in earlier on in 1 Corinthians where he acknowledges that what he's saying isn't from God, it is himself. So I think maybe he's writing, he means what I'm saying here is a command of the Lord, not necessarily what I say in all my letters everywhere. I think that might be reading too much into it.
Probably is, yeah.
Because he's sort of saying that, I guess he's saying if you claim to be a prophet or have spiritual powers, then you need to acknowledge that what I've just said about doing stuff in order and such like is a command. But I don't think he's claiming that everything he writes is a command.
No.
Otherwise he's clearly contradicting himself.
But it does seem that the letters of Paul were recognized right from early canons, and they weren't disputed. They authentically Paul.
Yes.
But interestingly, the books that were disputed most of the Bible, if you take the 4 Gospels and the letters of Paul, that takes up over 80% of the New Testament. So right from the very beginning, that there was pretty well a consensus around the 4 Gospels, Acts, and Paul's letters, the authentically ones. And then these ones get disputed. Sometimes they're in lists, sometimes they're not. And the problem is, it seems, is the authenticity of the authorship. And interestingly, that in early times, there were discussions about, are these really authentic? Was Revelation really written by John? If it was, it's in. If it wasn't, it's out. And that was the question. And today, if you pick up a commentary on Revelation, the first thing that it'll talk about was whether this really was written by the Apostle John or not. So, and similarly with Hebrews, somebody will stand up in church and say, Paul's letter to the Hebrews, and somebody will say, no, it wasn't. And so, right at the beginning, they were arguing about whether it really was Paul. If it was Paul, it goes in. If it's not. But it seems, in the end of the day, they get the criteria that it is sufficiently close to, those authors, and it's sufficiently, it's sufficiently good in its teaching, and it's sufficiently relevant for the church, and therefore they get included. But guess which was the last book to be included?
Revelation.
Yeah. I don't think that's why it's at the end, actually. I think it's at the end because it ends up in the end, But Revelation was the last one to go in.
And that's the one that has the warning, doesn't it, about not adding to the Bible or taking away from it?
Yes. That's true, yeah. And just a few last little things. So these lists came about, and I think this is really kind of revealing as well. These lists that have been, and the first one was this moratorium fragment, which you talked about, and then the Council of Rome, sort of more in 382, 4th century, sort of settles it. Until this, I didn't know this, but until 16th century, 1546, the Council of Trent, which was the Roman Catholic Council that countered the Reformation. They add the Deuterocanonical, actually those books which are now in the Catholic Bible that aren't in the Protestant one. Church of England and the Presbyterians decided theirs in 1563, and our lot, the Reformed churches, in 1647 with the Westminster Confession, and the Eastern Orthodox in 1672. So it was this 16th, 17th century that where we get to, the current day, the modern day Bibles. I mean, basically restating, what had already been agreed, but nevertheless, becomes authoritative at the time of the Reformation and the changes that took place then. And then just these, very quickly, but these are the books on the left-hand side which are added to the Catholic Bible, and on the other side, these are the books that appear in the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Church, and that includes Psalm 151, which is here. Anybody like to read Psalm 151?
I'll read it.
Yeah.
I was small among my brothers and the youngest in my father's house. I tended my father's sheep. My hands made a harp, my fingers fashioned a lyre. And who will tell my Lord? The Lord himself, it is he who hears. It was he who sent his messenger and took me from my father's sheep and anointed me with his anointing oil. My brothers were handsome and tall, but the Lord was not pleased with them. I went out to meet the Philistine, and he cursed me by his idols. But I drew his own sword, I beheaded him, and took away disgrace from the people of Israel.
There you go. David's psalm after fighting Goliath.
Mm.
Psalm 151. I just want to kind of close with I just thought a kind of hypothetical question. Supposing somebody doing a dig, in Syria today, discovers the Gospel of St. Andrew, which is good, sound teaching. It is closely aligned with the other four Gospels, and it has some other material which isn't in the other Gospels, more about the birth of Jesus and a little bit more about his adolescence. What do we do with that? If it feels a really good book, very beautifully written book, and has a real sense of authenticity, do we bring this into the Bible? And who would decide? And by what authority? Or do we just put it on one side and say, this is a nice read, What would we do with it?
Violet. Just
What?
violet. Just violet. Yeah.
Keep things as they are.
Yeah.
I'd probably make it available for people to read, but I think it would probably be too complicated to make it part of the Bible, because of the whole historical dimension there that it would bypass. I'm not sure that it's up to us to suddenly say, well, actually, this should be in as well. Because who's to say somebody else in the future might not come up with something more sinister? So you might be setting a dangerous precedent, in the way that the Nazis tried very hard to take all the Jewish bits out of the Bible. And
Right.
I know they're taking bits out, but I think if you start tampering with it, you are perhaps doing something dangerous. But I would certainly commend people to read it. Just as I guess it's helpful to read the Apocrypha, New Testament and Old Testament. Helpful to read these books, the useful background information.
Yeah. I mean, I think those early sources, I mean, they're kind of quite clear, aren't they? That the early church did give us a witness. They did intend future generations to have, the eyewitness accounts. And I think a lot of modern biblical scholarship which has been very forensic about the text, has taken away that sense of, it really was stuff that happened, and it really, people did see these things and they did write them down because they wanted people to understand and know and have that experience and where they've embellished for good motivation. You know, I mean, to add. If you take Matthew, you know, he's got this basic story, and he's added onto it, you know, the story of the Old Testament onto the way in which he tells that, which is just sheer genius, you know. And Mark too, you know, just how he takes that very urgent situation in which he's writing, you know, and makes the story of this non-violence, you know, alternative approach to dealing with political conflict, how he weaves that into a story based on the raw data of, you know, the life of Jesus.